force the day-to-day operations of CBP's intelligence enterprise, including the tactical and operational analysis that drives law enforcement operational activities. Mr. Mandrick previously served as a senior executive overseeing the National Border Security Intelligence Watch. Thank you for being here, good sir. Our next witness is Mr. George S. Papadopoulos, who was most recently appointed as the United States Drug Enforcement Administration's Principal Deputy Administrator. That's quite a title. Prior to this role, Mr. Papadopoulos served as the agency's acting chief of operations, where he oversaw all operational and enforcement matters for the DEA. Thank you for being here today, good sir. Mr. Tyrone Durham is the acting director of the Nation State Threat Center in the Office of Intelligence and Analysis at the Department of Homeland Security. And I thank you, Mr. Durham, for joining us today. I thank all the witnesses for joining us. And I now recognize Mr. Chester for 5 minutes to summarize his opening statement.
Chairman Higgins, Ranking Member Correa, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today on the very real challenge we confront from the production and trafficking of deadly synthetic opioids across our borders and into our communities. I know I don't need to remind anyone here that someone in America dies from a drug overdose or poisoning about every 5 minutes of every hour of every day. That is why the President made ending the opioid epidemic a key pillar in his unity agenda, challenging us to change the trajectory of this crisis and save American lives. Not long ago, the dominant model of drug trafficking involved plant-based drugs like cocaine or heroin or methamphetamine made from crude chemicals, moved through a hierarchical drug trafficking organization and eventually sold in a face-to-face cash transaction somewhere in the United States. While that structure still exists, it has been joined by a synthetic opioid production and supply chain that operates as a global business and exploits the structure of legitimate commerce to obtain precursor chemicals, move funds, and make internet-based sales of raw materials and finished drugs using both fiat and cryptocurrency. And today, the ability of an American teenager to find illicit drugs is literally in the palm of their hand and as simple as opening a social media app. We are in the midst of a strategic transition between two eras, where the cultivation and production of large volumes of plant-based drugs has not ended, but the era of small volume, high-potency synthetic opioid production has clearly begun. This problem does not start at our border, and it will not end at our border, and it is a national security and economic prosperity problem as much as it is a law enforcement and public health one. In April of this year, the administration announced its strategic approach to disrupt the global illicit fentanyl supply chain. We call this approach commercial disruption, which focuses and synchronizes all the tools of national power to simultaneously attack 4 key vulnerabilities in the supply chain: precursor chemicals, the pill presses, dye molds, and encapsulating machines used to create counterfeit pills, the commercial shipping that moves these items around the world, and the flow of financial benefits and operating capital to those involved in the illicit drug industry. As part of this, we maintain close and mutually beneficial partnerships with key countries such as Mexico and India, who play a role in preventing the proliferation of these dangerous synthetic drugs and in advancing our efforts to disrupt their supply chain. And so for an issue in which United States and PRC interests align, we are disappointed that they've chosen not to substantively engage with the United States on counter-narcotics for more than a year. But this is a global problem, and United States leadership is essential. Under our leadership, the international community has scheduled nearly a dozen precursor chemicals, and we've raised global awareness of the illicit synthetic drug supply chain. Last week, Director Gupta joined Secretary of State Blinken for the first meeting of the Global Coalition Against Synthetic Drugs. More than 80 countries convened at the ministerial level to accelerate efforts against synthetic drugs. Our efforts to reduce the presence of these drugs in our communities must be closely linked with our equally strong efforts to decrease their use. And the administration is committing a historic level of resources to lower the demand for these drugs and keep Americans safe from their harms. The simple truth is, it cannot be easier to get illicit drugs in America than it is to get treatment. We are seeing some signs of progress. Just today, the CDC released new data on provisional drug overdose deaths showing a continued flattening of drug overdose deaths through early 2023, halting a period of rapid increase from 2019 to 2021. But that is not enough. Now is the time to redouble our efforts, accelerate our work, and move this nation and the world beyond a crisis that has vexed us for the better part of a decade. People in the throes of addiction are in a fight every day, and they should expect nothing less from us as well. On behalf of Dr. Gupta and the hardworking people at the Office of National Drug Control Policy, I would like to thank this subcommittee and your congressional colleagues for your leadership and bipartisanship on this incredibly difficult issue. Ending the opioid and overdose epidemic demands the best efforts of us all, and we look forward to continuing our work with you. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chester. I now recognize Mr. Kagan for 5 minutes to summarize his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman. Chairman Higgins, Ranking Member Correa, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to be here today to discuss Homeland Security Investigation's efforts to disrupt and dismantle transnational criminal organizations and combat the flow of illicit fentanyl into the United States. As a principal investigative component of the Department of Homeland Security, HSI combats transnational criminal organizations at every critical location within the illicit supply chain, internationally, where TCOs operate and manufacture illicit narcotics, at our nation's physical borders, where smugglers attempt to exploit America's legitimate trade, travel, and financial systems, and domestically, where the criminal organizations earn substantial profits from selling this poison to our friends, neighbors, and family members. The threat posed by TCOs is pervasive. These organizations do not limit themselves to a single criminal enterprise and have evolved beyond narcotic smuggling into polycriminal organizations involved in weapons trafficking, cybercrime, human smuggling, money laundering, and more, all of which HSI investigates. HSI combats TCOs by using its unique, broad investigative authorities to enforce over 400 federal laws and target TCOs from multiple investigative angles. Simply put, HSI attacks the entire illicit network. Mexican cartels have taken over fentanyl production and operate on an industrial scale, where they obtain precursor chemicals from China and synthesize these chemicals in Mexico to produce the deadly poison. Chinese criminal organizations further facilitate the trafficking and distribution of fentanyl pills through the sale of industrial pill press equipment to Mexican cartels. The Mexican cartel's ability to traffic deadly fentanyl into the United States is greatly enhanced by Chinese money laundering organizations. Chinese money laundering organizations have developed sophisticated networks in the US, Mexico, China, and throughout Asia to facilitate their money laundering schemes. These organizations have a vast global infrastructure to clean illicit proceeds for various criminal organizations, mostly including Mexican cartels. HSI's counter-TCO efforts begin abroad, where we have the largest international investigative presence within DHS, comprised of hundreds of HSI special agents, strategically assigned in 93 offices in 56 countries. This includes offices located in Mexico, where the vast majority of fentanyl is produced, and throughout the Asia-Pacific region, where the precursor chemicals originate. HSI's international efforts are greatly enhanced by our transnational criminal investigative units, or TCIUs, comprised of vetted foreign law enforcement officials and prosecutors who lead some of HSI's most significant and mutually beneficial extraterritorial investigations and prosecutions targeting TCOs. At our nation's physical borders, HSI works with our DHS partners to combat TCO movements of illicit goods. HSI's Border Enforcement Security Task Force, or BEST task forces, represent one of the agency's premier tools for turning border seizures into TCO toppling investigations. HSI's partnerships, including task force officers from CBP and DEA, are integral to the whole of government approach in countering TCOs that traffic narcotics that threaten the public safety of the United States. There are currently 90 BESTs comprised of law enforcement officers from more than 200 agencies and National Guard units. HSI is simultaneously attacking the illicit narcotics supply chain through an intelligence-based counter-narcotics operation that blends traditional investigative and analytical techniques with interagency collaboration, industry partners, and computer-based tools to disrupt and dismantle the chemical supply chain. The interdiction of precursor shipments plays a key role in disrupting the TCO's ability to produce a finished product before it even gets to our borders. HSI's Operation Hydra has seized or disrupted the delivery of more than 3 million pounds of precursor chemicals that were destined for narcotics production in Mexican labs in Mexico. HSI has also launched a targeted enforcement campaign to combat fentanyl. This year, HSI and CBP initiated Operation Blue Lotus, which surged resources to key locations, both domestically and internationally, to target fentanyl and develop criminal cases along the southwest border. Operation Blue Lotus resulted in the seizure of more than 8,200 pounds of fentanyl, thereby decreasing the flow of illicit fentanyl smuggled into the United States from Mexico, while simultaneously illuminating TCO networks. Working alongside our partners here today, HSI remains dedicated to stemming the flow of illicit narcotics at every critical location within the supply chain. Thank you again for the opportunity to appear before you today and your continued support for HSI and our enduring effort to attack the flow of illicit fentanyl into the United States. I look forward to your questions today.
Thank you, Mr. Kagan. I now recognize Mr. Mandrick for 5 minutes to summarize his opening statements.
Chairman Higgins, Ranking Member Correa, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify here today about the fentanyl threat and CBP's intelligence and data-driven response and approach to combating this proliferation of this dangerous drug. CBP uses multifaceted approaches to counter fentanyl. Our approach includes advanced detection capabilities, such as specialized canines and non-intrusive inspection equipment, intelligence collection, research and analysis, laboratory testing and scientific analysis, domestic and foreign partnerships, and most importantly, the experience, expertise, and dedication of the CBP workforce. This enforcement posture has led to record-level seizures, including over 22,000 pounds of fentanyl so far this fiscal year, the equivalent of over 90 million doses and over $1 billion in cartel profits. Today, I'd like to provide a little more information about the composition of the fentanyl seized by CBP, current production and smuggling trends, and the significance of our enforcement efforts within this threat landscape. When it comes to composition, this fiscal year, 88% of the fentanyl seized by CBP has been in pill form, continuing the trending shift away from powder. The concerning shift indicates an increased sophistication of the transnational criminal organizations to control production and mimic legitimate pharmaceuticals that ultimately target unsuspecting end users. Another growing trend we've witnessed is the expanded use of xylazine as an adulterant in fentanyl to extend a user's high. Xylazine, a central nervous system depressant, is not an opioid, so naloxone does not reverse its effects, making this dangerous synthetic combination even more deadly. The production of illicit fentanyl entering the U.S. shifted back in 2020. At that time, fentanyl was produced as a finished product in China, then smuggled into Mexico, and then onward to the United States. Over the past 3 years, production has shifted to Mexico-based TCOs that infiltrate supply chains to import precursor and pre-precursor chemicals, primarily from China, and then recruit or coerce scientists to produce metric tons of finished fentanyl. Through intelligence-led operations such as Operation Artemis, CBP has identified previously unknown logistical supply chains, some of whom that transshipped the United States before arriving in Mexico. Discoveries that have led to changes in cargo inspections and processing and resulted in significant seizures of precursors, pill presses, and dye molds, as well as the identification of unknown criminal actors. Within Mexico, we continue to see elevated levels of violence between cartels along lucrative smuggling corridors, especially in Mexico's northern border states. TCOs involved in trafficking synthetics have begun to expand from historic strongholds in western Mexico to access additional smuggling corridors in eastern Mexico through newfound alliances. These types of alliances have always been driven by monetary gain. What has changed is how profits from these illicit activities are transferred and distributed. Historically, CBP saw a major portion of illicit proceeds depart the U.S. as bulk cash currency. However, TCOs are increasingly taking advantage of technologies like cryptocurrency and informal value transfer systems, such as the Chinese underground banking system, to reduce their risk of cross-border interdiction. Exploitation of these systems allows for immediate transfers of illicit profits from the U.S. to the TCO hierarchy in Mexico, and in many cases, these money transfers are done cheaper than historic laundering options, and in most cases, with guaranteed success for the customer. Furthermore, TCOs continue to seek opportunities to move their illicit profits from the U.S. without currency or monetary instruments, including trade-based money laundering and the acquisition of firearms in the U.S. that are smuggled into Mexico to help control those corridors. The complex challenges require strong and deliberate partnerships across the government at all levels, as well as with our international partners. Exemplified by the success of recent intelligence and data-driven operations such as Operation Blue Lotus, Four Horsemen, Rolling Wave, and Operation Artemis, our CBP's hand-in-hand work with our investigative partners becoming critical to disrupting and dismantling the networks behind fentanyl synthesis. In just 2 months, Operation Blue Lotus and Operation Four Horsemen resulted in the seizure of nearly 10,000 pounds of fentanyl and almost 300 arrests. CBP is currently executing Operation Artemis and Operation Rolling Wave, which target the illicit procurement, manufacturing, and trafficking of fentanyl and precursor chemicals by leveraging investigative, prosecutorial, and regulatory resources and enhancing law enforcement information sharing and coordination. In addition to our close work with U.S. partners, CBP has strong relationships with foreign and industry partners across the globe to further detect, disrupt, and dismantle criminal organizations. The consistent evolution of technology and the adaptability of transnational criminal groups requires us to become more adaptable and combat these challenges. I thank you for your continued support for CBP and the opportunity to testify on this important topic today. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Mandrick. I now recognize Mr. Papadopoulos for 5 minutes to summarize his opening statement.
Good afternoon, Chairman Higgins, Ranking Member Correa, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. On behalf of the Department of Justice, and in particular the more than 9,000 employees of the Drug Enforcement Administration, it's my honor to appear before you today. Today's hearing comes at a critical moment in our country's history, and I thank the committee for bringing attention to this important topic. Our nation is in the midst of a devastating drug poisoning epidemic that claimed the lives of nearly 110,000 people in 2022. That's about 1 death every 5 minutes, or more than 300 mothers and fathers, sisters and brothers, and most tragically children dying every day, with countless more non-fatal drug poisonings. I've had the privilege of being a DEA special agent for 27 years and have served in locations as diverse as Detroit, Michigan, and Athens, Greece. I worked at the DEA Special Operations Division and most recently was Deputy Chief of Operations responsible for all foreign offices. I can assure you that the drug poisoning epidemic that our country is facing today is unprecedented. In 2022, DEA seized more than 58 million fentanyl-laced pills and 13,000 pounds of fentanyl powder. That's nearly 400 million deadly doses that didn't reach American streets, and more than enough to kill everyone in the United States. The men and women of the DEA are relentlessly focused, day in and day out, on saving lives by combating the deadly drug poisoning epidemic and bringing those responsible to justice. As the primary United States government agency responsible for investigating drug trafficking, the DEA leads and coordinates the whole of government law enforcement response to defeat the 2 cartels responsible for flooding the United States with fentanyl, the Sinaloa and Jalisco cartels. This is our top operational priority because these cartels pose the greatest criminal drug threat that the United States has ever faced. They are ruthless and violent global criminal enterprises with members, associates, facilitators, and brokers in all 50 states and in at least 100 countries throughout the world. The cartels use treachery and deceit to drive addiction and deaths in our country. They mix fentanyl with other drugs like cocaine, heroin, and methamphetamine, and press it into pills that look like legitimate prescription medication. But the pills that look safe and familiar do not contain any prescription medication. Instead, they contain deadly fentanyl. Many people that died didn't even know they were taking fentanyl. Instead, they believed they were taking a different drug or a real prescription pill. To save lives and defeat these cartels, the DEA created 2 counter-threat teams, one for the Sinaloa cartel and one for the Jalisco cartel. These teams synthesized DEA intelligence for a data-driven approach to mapping and strategically targeting the cartel's entire network and infrastructure, and to identify key nodes that can be exploited. Our counter-threat teams regularly send target packages to DEA offices across the country and around the world that are used to initiate or enhance investigations. Along with our interagency partners, we've had some recent success against the cartels. In April, we announced the results of an 18-month undercover investigation, Operation Royal Flush, which resulted in the indictment of 28 members of the Sinaloa cartel, including Chapo Guzman's sons. The indictment describes the cartel's entire network and supply chain, from China to Mexico to Main Street. During this investigation, which included 32 DEA offices around the world and operational activities in 10 countries, we seized more than 22 million potentially deadly doses of fentanyl. In May, we announced the results of Operation Last Mile, which focused on the cartel's U.S. distributors. During this year-long effort, we arrested more than 3,300 people in the United States, seized more than $104 million in cash and assets, and took nearly 8,500 guns off the street. Most importantly, we stopped more than 193 million potentially deadly doses of fentanyl before they reached U.S. communities. And just last month, we announced the results of Operation Killer Chemicals, which focused on the precursor chemicals needed to manufacture fentanyl. We charged 8 Chinese nationals, and for the first time, 4 Chinese companies with conspiracy to manufacture and import fentanyl into the United States. These individuals and companies sold enough precursor chemicals to produce millions of potentially deadly doses of fentanyl. While we've had some success, there's clearly more work to do. The men and women of the DEA are committed to saving lives and defeating the Sinaloa and Jalisco cartels, and will relentlessly pursue cartel leaders, members, associates, and facilitators to ensure that they face justice for their crimes. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today on this important topic. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Papadopoulos. I now recognize Mr. Durham for 5 minutes to summarize his opening statement.
Good afternoon, Chairman Higgins, Ranking Member Correa, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. I'm honored to be here representing the Department of Homeland Security's Office of Intelligence and Analysis and the dedicated intelligence professionals working diligently to keep the homeland safe, secure, and resilient. As previously stated, the fentanyl drug overdose crisis in the United States, which is fueled by Mexican transnational criminal organizations and their Chinese suppliers of precursor chemicals, continues at epidemic proportions. As you know, the drug overdose deaths rose from 2019 to 2021, with more than 100,000 plus deaths reported in 2021. And those deaths, specifically involving synthetic opioids, primarily fentanyl, continued to rise during the same time period, with more than 70,000 overdose deaths reported at that same time period. So let's talk about who's responsible. You previously heard about the 2 Mexican cartels responsible for the activity, the Sinaloa cartel and the Jalisco New Generation cartel. These cartels supply U.S.-based affiliates with fentanyl for further distribution and retail-level sale. U.S.-based traffickers then sell fentanyl to users seeking the synthetic opioid. They mix fentanyl with other controlled substances, and they distribute it in the form of counterfeit prescription pills to drive addiction. China's role in the global fentanyl trade is also a serious concern. China is the source of most of the precursor chemicals required for fentanyl production. A cartel associate brokers the sale and shipment of fentanyl, precursor chemicals from China, to clandestine labs in Mexico, where the fentanyl is manufactured. Moreover, as law enforcement scrutiny or legal restrictions increase, suppliers adapt by modifying or changing chemical compounds of precursors, subsequently falling outside the purview of existing controls to mimic the desired effect. And some Chinese chemists have focused on precursors to precursors, many of which have legitimate uses and are therefore hard to regulate. There are several reasons why China is such a major source of fentanyl production. First, China has a large and sophisticated chemical and pharmaceutical industry that can produce its precursor chemicals at will and at scale. Second, China has a lax regulatory environment for chemicals, making it easy for traffickers to acquire the precursors they need for fentanyl manufacture. And third, China's borders are porous, making it easy for fentanyl precursors to be smuggled out of the country, ultimately making their way to Mexico. The Office of Intelligence and Analysis is producing finished intelligence on drug trafficking and other transborder threats to strengthen engagement between U.S. officials and foreign partners. Specific to drug trafficking threats, our analysis is aimed at identifying key transnational criminal organized crime leadership figures, organizational networks, logistical supply chains, smuggling routes, and the efforts of corruption that stand in the way of dismantling these organized crime groups. Intelligence products draw upon national-level reporting from the intelligence community, fused with DHS unique data from components as well as information from our law enforcement partners across all levels of government. This finished intelligence product related to TCOs are written at the widest possible dissemination level for distribution to our federal, state, local, tribal, and territorial partners, and when appropriate, shared with our foreign partners in Mexico. INA's deployed intelligence personnel work closely with DHS components, state and major urban area fusion centers, and other law enforcement agencies to gather, analyze, and report information that is uniquely available from these partners. Thank you again for the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss this critical threat and for your continued support of the Office of Intelligence and Analysis. We remain committed to keeping the homeland safe, secure, and resilient, and will continue our efforts at home and abroad to uphold the national security and public safety of the United States. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Durham. Members will be recognized by order of seniority for their 5 minutes of questioning. An additional round of questioning may be called after all members have been recognized. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes of questioning. Mr. Papadopoulos, I'd like to ask you, in your opening statement, you cited that you've identified major distribution hubs in cities, including Phoenix, Los Angeles, Denver, and Chicago. Is that in your opening statement?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so a general question would be, obviously, without revealing ongoing law enforcement investigations and operations, if you've identified the major hubs of narcotics distributions in these cities, Phoenix, Los Angeles, Denver, and Chicago, can we look forward to major arrests in Phoenix, Los Angeles, Denver, and Chicago?
Yes, sir. As you know, the DEA is constantly working these investigations. I mentioned Operation Last Mile, which was announced in May, which is a year-long effort focusing on the U.S. distributors of these cartels, where we arrested over 3,300 people, seized $104 million in cash and assets, and took about 8,500 guns off the street. That was across the entire U.S.
Understood. The American citizenry asks common sense questions, and we are sworn by our oath to convey those questions. And it's a good question. If you've identified a narcotics hub, and that means you're watching it, so we expect those people to be arrested. The volume of drugs seized and the arrests made is reflective of the realities of effective law enforcement, but also the overwhelming amount of trafficking that we're dealing with and the criminal activity. It's at a level we've not seen in America, and we expect large numbers of arrests. If we identify these guys, we've got to break their back, make them eat each other. That's just fine with me. Director Kagan, last Congress, I introduced the Homeland Security Fentanyl Enforcement Act. You're familiar, sir. This bill is written to expand Homeland Security Investigations Authority to investigate narcotics cases under Title 21. Can you explain why HSI is currently unable to conduct independent narcotics investigations? This gets into some jurisdictional authority that Congress should be involved in, so I ask you to clarify.
Mr. Higgins, thank you for the support on this topic. HSI enjoys a great long history and long relationship with the DEA, 25 years plus, and we look forward to the next 25 years. Right now, our authority is derived from DEA's designation, which allows us to work together, us to focus on our foreign counterparts, our foreign customs authorities, working with our TCIUs overseas, and to continue to work. Actually, Mr. Papadopoulos and I worked in the same Fusion Center building together here in DC a long time ago and had a great relationship. So just look forward to having that continued relationship moving forward.
Yeah, we understand and we appreciate the fact that long-standing relationships have been developed between the law enforcement agencies and working on the ground, but we must ensure that you have the legal pathway, a statutory pathway to conduct your investigation, sometimes in cooperation with other agencies, but with an independent capability that we must ensure. So I look forward to speaking with my colleagues more about the Homeland Security Fentanyl Enforcement Act. Mr. Chester, China is the main country of origin for precursor chemicals for synthetic opioids. These chemicals are then taken by the cartels and make drugs like fentanyl. We all understand that. You've made that clear. Can you characterize a coordinated effort between the cartels and China to create and distribute illicit drugs like fentanyl, and how is that changing as we speak?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. So the first major change happened in 2019 when China scheduled, at the United States request, scheduled fentanyl as a class. And what that did was it had the effect of reducing finished fentanyl from China to the United States to almost zero, and the traffickers got into the precursor business, selling those to Mexican cartels for production. The coordination happens on a couple of different levels. The first one is there is a broker, usually located in Mexico, that works with a broker in the PRC in order to order the chemicals, often from a legitimate chemical company who fills the bill, and those chemicals are transported and shipped, usually on an unwitting carrier, to one of the ports in Mexico or via air, where at the port of entry it is diverted, and then delivered to the drug manufacturers. That's the raw materials. And then the payment for that is usually done through illicit finance enablers and brokers located in the PRC and in Mexico. And it is this network of brokers between the drug producers and the raw material suppliers that gives this entire global illicit supply chain its life.
Thank you, Mr. Chester. It's a massive network. We intend to break it. My time has expired. I recognize the ranking member, my friend and colleague, Mr. Correa, the gentleman from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to follow up on the chairman's last comment on China, their role. Their cooperation, has it been better in the past? 2019, they helped us. Classified fentanyl, stopped it. Now you got the issue of precursors to precursors, harder to regulate. Has China helped us over the last year or two? Or have you seen that level of cooperation maybe not as good as it's been in the past?
Thank you for your question. Your question is very prescient. And the answer is cooperation in the past actually has brought results. And in fact, in the words of Chinese diplomats, counter-narcotics cooperation between the United States and the PRC has been a bright spot. And we were able to there was routine law enforcement cooperation. We were able to get fentanyl scheduled as a class. As of late, over more than a year, for a variety of reasons, the PRC has decided not to engage with the United States on counter-narcotics and a number of other issues. The United States would like that level of cooperation again. And we have made it clear to the PRC a few things. The first one is, we're not blaming the PRC government for this. There are criminal elements within China and Mexico and the United States who keep this global illicit supply chain alive. That's the first thing. The second thing is our cooperation is absolutely essential in order to help us with that. And we have made some very specific asks of the Chinese government that they could implement very easily in order to be able to help us to do that.
Gentlemen, I just want to say thank you for your good work. You've done a stellar job of doing what you're paid to do. We talk about commercial disruption, precursors, pills, shipping. And it's as though every time you stop one place, something else explodes. I've heard lately that there's intel now, a lot of the precursors are coming in through our ports of entry. pill presses coming into the United States. So every time you bottle something up, another source, another supply seems to emerge. The one issue that I think probably holds everything together is the finances, the laundering of this money. What can we do to better enable you to stop the flow of these profits? HSI, you talked about, the chairman asked you about maybe some other tools you may need, but I would ask all of you, what else can we do as members of Congress to strengthen your hand to stop the flow of the profits? Because, you dry up the money and the whole machine comes to a stop. I mean, right now what we're witnesses in this country is a massive transfer of wealth from American pocketbooks to somewhere around the country. Around the world. Please, open it up for comments.
Since you mentioned HSI, I'll take that. Money is moved in multiple ways. They're all ever evolving. You just mentioned the fact that we stop one thing that the Chinese are doing and they move in a different way. The same thing happens with money laundering. It's bulk cash, it's trade-based money laundering, it's cryptocurrency movement of money right now. One thing, and I come back to, begin and end in China. China has taken over, Chinese money laundering organizations have taken over the network, the money movement network, which we're all focused on, as everybody sitting up here is focused on that. They're able to charge much lower percentages than other people have in the past because of their vast network around the world. But we are. HSI that's what we do. We like to go after their money. We like to go after their toys. Because when you take their money away, then they can't flourish. So,
and I've asked you directly, I called you out because I've seen you work. And I've seen some of your results when I've been down to San Isidro. I've taken a tour of your operations.
Yes, sir.
And all of you doing a stellar job. And the half minute that I have left, I would just ask you all as a challenge to let us know what we can do as Congress to strengthen your hand when it comes to money laundering. It's not an easy solution. You got 20 seconds. You're not going to give me the answer. But I'd love all of you to go back and give us some, wish list, legislatively, what tools and what resources you need to stop the flow of drug money. In my opinion, that's the best punch you can give these folks when it comes to fentanyl. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Time is up. Turn it over back to you.
Gentleman yields. The gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Brasheen, is recognized for 5 minutes for question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you all being here today. There's no doubt this is a crisis. Just in Oklahoma alone, the state that I'm a representative for, we've seen a 735% increase in fentanyl deaths. And that has occurred from 2018 to 2022. 326 deaths in 2022 in Oklahoma. In 2018, it was 39. And I think probably every member of this committee has some personal point of contact with somebody that they know of who has lost their life or has a direct connection. It's really sad. I guess what I want to zero in on, and I'll open this up to anyone, if 6 out of the 10 pills that you all are looking at, one of your testimonies a minute ago, are containing lethal overdose elements to the point that you take it unsuspectingly, it can kill you. Why are they doing that? There's an addictive element, right? They're trying to use the addictive element, 10 cents to make and $10 to $30 sold, massive increase in profit. So I'd be interested in some comments if you can help bring about why they are enabling such a lethal concoction in their pills.
Congressman, I can start and then I can turn it over to my colleagues. I think the first thing is that that our image of these drug producers and traffickers, I think traditionally has been that they're evildoers who are out to hurt people, when in reality, they are disinterested business people who really only want a few things. They want to lower their production cost. They want to lower their risk of detection and interdiction. They want to increase their customer base and increase their profits. And in a mechanism to do that is to provide the drug user an experience that they did not expect. And this is what we saw back in 2015 when we started to see synthetic opioids like fentanyl introduced into the heroin supply chain. And this was the door that opened this up for the United States. What it did, it provided the individual a qualitative effect that they did not expect, and it was used as kind of a branding. Because these things are so potent, and because they are so potentially lethal, a milligram in the wrong direction will take you from having a qualitative experience that you didn't expect to an overdose death. And in a lot of cases, these things are not uniformly mixed and they're not done well, and it's a lot of cross-contamination that actually leads to the overdose death. The last thing I'll tell you is, in a lot of cases, the unwitting user who may not have an active substance use disorder or does not intend to take fentanyl gets it in another counterfeit pill that they did not expect, like Xanax or Adderall or something like that. This is done in the interest of making money with a casual disinterest as to whether people are harmed or not.
So I want to pivot because I think somebody else maybe in the panel can answer this. Are you seeing it utilized as a revenge element? So you're saying that there's nothing that's in this more than profit margin, but there's an evil intent that can lead to murder purposefully. In your investigations, are you seeing that?
Sir, I can jump in. So the answer is yes. We have evidence in some of the previous cases I mentioned where the cartels knew that there was deadly fentanyl. The amount of fentanyl that they were sending to the U.S. was deadly because they tested it on human beings in Mexico, and they still sent it anyway. As Mr. Chester was saying, these are not mixed in labs. They're not sterile situations. And we've seen pills with less than 1 milligram of fentanyl all the way up to 8 milligrams of fentanyl. The average dose is 2.4 milligrams, and 2 milligrams is considered a potentially deadly dose.
In regards to human trafficking, Sound of Freedom is a movie that's getting a lot of attention right now nationally, and you can sell a drug one time. Commonly being discussed is the human trafficking element that you can sell an individual multiple times. What are you seeing with the human traffic in all of your investigations? Where are you seeing the overlap with those that are engaged in human trafficking, prostitution, also alongside the fentanyl trade?
Thank you for the question, sir. So historically, we had seen the transnational criminal groups focused on narcotics. We're solely focused on narcotics. They would charge a peso or a tax for migrants to cross. At the beginning of COVID, where we started to see some of the closures at the ports of entry for non-essential travel, we started to see those criminal groups become more involved in the process holistically. So it wasn't just a couple $100 tax, it was a multi-$1,000 program to move them throughout the whole chain. That's what we've continued to see, is that control of the plazas along the border, and now that full-scale facilitation from start to finish.
Mr. Chairman, if anybody else has any, I know my time has expired. Does anybody else have any comments on that?
I can draw this distinction a little bit between the human smuggling and human trafficking aspect, which I think is where your question was going. We don't see a direct link between your large-scale criminal organizations that are operating and moving people trafficking-wise, human trafficking-wise across the border, like the transnational criminal organizations. A lot of those folks are already here. People are smuggled into the United States, and then once in the United States, transnational or organizations prey on vulnerable populations, and that's when they're turned into trafficking victims.
Thank you.
Gentleman yields. Mr. Thanadar is recognized for 5 minutes for questioning.
Thank you, Chairman Higgins. And thank you, gentlemen, for your testimony. I have heard from both sides of the aisle that transnational criminal organizations and the smuggling of illicit drugs like fentanyl is not just a U.S. problem, it is a global issue. There are bad actors all over the world looking to profit from these deadly drugs. That's why it is important to foster relationships with law enforcement partners and international governments to disrupt and dismantle transnational criminal organizations. Mr. Kagan, you mentioned this point in your testimony. So my question is for you, Mr. Kagan, and also for Mr. Papadopoulos. Can you, and in fact, I have three questions. Let me just state those and allow you, either of you, to comment on. Can you discuss how HSI and the DEA are working and sharing information across the federal government as well as state and local law enforcement partners to investigate and prosecute these criminal organizations? Number two, can you discuss how HSI and DEA are fostering relationships internationally to prevent these deadly drugs from reaching our borders? And number three, in April 2023, the Justice Department announced charges against several leaders of the Sinaloa cartel. What role did these partnerships play in these critical investigations?
Thank you very much for the question. I think it's a fantastic question, and I've mentioned it in my opening statement and in a statement already before. HSI and DEA have a long history of working together. I mentioned that we both worked together in the same building, which is actually a fusion center where we bring in information, intelligence, and 30-plus federal agencies sit in this building where we share information and ensure that we're taking a whole-of-government approach towards attacking the cartels and the transnational criminal organizations. We both have very similar tactics as well when we're working with our international partners. Both have investigative units. Ours is called a transnational criminal investigative unit. Very different, but the same structure. Ours, we've got the ability to work with the Mexican customs where we can stop things that are coming over the ports, like precursor chemicals that are shipped from China over the sea, things like that. I think that we have a very good international relationship with Mexico and other countries on the working level, which is how we all get our job done to go after transnational criminal organizations.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question, sir. So as far as information sharing, we are in, as I mentioned, unprecedented times right now, which I think calls for unprecedented collaboration across the federal, state, and local governments. We are committed to that. We are using every tool that we have available, including sanctions and rewards for justice, to get the word out. As far as our international relationships, we have a big international presence also, and that's because we want to be proactive. Most drugs are manufactured outside of the United States, and then they need to be transported here through other countries. So when we're outside of the United States working with our international counterparts, we are being proactive instead of reactive, waiting for the drugs to get here. As far as the case that you mentioned, we did work closely on that investigation with other districts and other agencies to put that case together.
All right. Thank you so much. And Mr. Chairman, my time is up, so I yield back.
The gentleman yields. My colleague from Texas, Mr. Gonzalez, is recognized for 5 minutes for questioning.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you for holding this this hearing. I want to use my time to talk about fentanyl as it relates to drones. I think this is an area that the landscape is changing. If you're watching the war in Ukraine, you're seeing that drones are the future of conflict, and that's no difference from fentanyl. And what I'm seeing on a regular basis, cartels are using drones to penetrate the United States airspace, and they're dropping off packages of fentanyl. Remember, you don't need large quantities in order to make a lot of money off of this. And then they're taking that and they're moving it around. Well, let me just set the tone. Imagine if you're in a soccer field and all of a sudden there's a drone that flies over with fentanyl, and it doesn't drop it to get picked up and get sold somewhere. It just drops it in the stadium. Could we live in that world? Well, guess what? We already live in that world. So I'm very concerned with the drones that are happening, and in particular in the cartels and how it's all related to fentanyl. My first question is for Mr. Mandrachek. Can you speak to any trends or observations you have seen with the recent rise in the use of drones to smuggle drugs across the border?
Thank you, sir. Historically, we had seen drones almost entirely used for surveillance along the border, whether that's at a port of entry or between ports of entry, where scouts located on the Mexican side would monitor the movements and then facilitate cross-border movement from there. We have started to see an increased number of SUAS incursions crossing the border, some of which are for surveillance purposes, but we have seen increased use, smuggling of some narcotics, primarily hard narcotics, those that, as you mentioned, don't require larger quantities for movement. We have in place a very strong counter-UAS program with our U.S. Border Patrol and our Air and Marine Operations Center that we'd love to give you a more in-depth briefing on the specific capabilities of that.
Great, thank you. I was just in El Paso a few weeks ago, and I visited two areas. One, I visited the Clint Station, Border Patrol Station. This is an area in the El Paso sector, but it's not the main one. It's not what you see on TV. It's one of the sectors that is in the lower valley, and it is historically known that this is the area that is most trafficked. And so I was asking the agents there, I was like, how many agents do you have on duty at one time? The answer was 2 agents, okay? My next question was, how much contraband have you apprehended this year? Guess what the answer was? 0, okay? So the most trafficked area in El Paso County, you only have 2 agents on duty, and they've apprehended nothing, okay? Go a little further, outside the city limits of El Paso is a brand new soft-sided facility. It's like going to the Dallas Cowboy Stadium, okay? It's like Disneyland, 360,000 square feet, larger than 6 football fields. It's costing taxpayers $400 million a year. Guess how many agents were in that facility? 208. What I'm getting at is we're putting all our resources into the humanitarian piece of it, and there's nobody on the field to actually stop some of the traffic that's happening. One of the agents told me, hey, look, I see drones, Tony, I see drones coming back and forth all the time, and I feel powerless. There is nothing I can do as a field agent down on the ground. What I'm also seeing, too, is all these procedures. You have to go through all these procedurals to be able to go all the way up the chain in order to get a response back. Once again, we are living in a different environment where things are tactical. You got to be able to give the agent the tools that they need to succeed in a real-time environment if we're going to save lives. I've got 1 minute left. Let me ask one more question. Once again for you, Mr. Mandrachek. What can the committee do to ensure that CBP and other appropriate agencies have what they need to combat drones that are illegally crossing our border?
Sir, what a lot of it comes down to is just the adaptability we are with the technology. The speed at which that grows, they're very cheap to collect, to produce, so it's kind of a twofold effort. So it's actually attacking logistical supply chains behind those to prevent those being moved into the hands of TCOs to use for facilitation, but also support in the technology to not just detect, but also safely bring down those pieces of aircraft, and then the exploitation after that. A significant investment from a technology and an expertise standpoint.
Well, I'd love to take you up on your offer and sit down and walk through this, in particular to these UAS vehicles that we can defeat, and talk about it not only in regards to the Homeland Security Committee, but I also sit in the Appropriations Committee. How can we give real money to real programs that work? I'm very interested in that. Would love to follow up with you. Mr. Chairman, I'm out of time. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. The gentlewoman, Ms. Ramirez, is recognized for 5 minutes for questioning.
Thank you, Chairman Higgins and Ranking Member Correa of the Border Subcommittee for convening today's hearing. However, I do wish that we could be focused on addressing the root causes of migration rather than having to debunk myths and respond to Republican fear-mongering. I sincerely hope we can look beyond the politics and work together to achieve comprehensive immigration reform and address the causes and the concerns we have around this opioid crisis. We know that nearly 90% of hard drugs, such as fentanyl, heroin, and methamphetamines, are seized by CBP at our ports of entry rather than between them. And even when hard drugs are seized between ports of entry, the vast majority are seized at vehicle checkpoints. Mr. Mandrick, can you confirm that nearly 90% of hard drugs seized are at ports of entry? Is that yes or no?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. And Mr. Mandrick, is it true that the vast majority of opioids seized between ports of entry are seized at vehicular checkpoints?
That's correct, ma'am.
Thank you. And Mr. Mandrick and I'm going to do my best because pronunciation is important to me. Mr. Papadopoulos, did I get it right? My understanding is that more than 85% of the people convicted for smuggling fentanyl are U.S. citizens. Is that accurate?
So, ma'am, I can talk about the seizures and then turn it over for the actual prosecutions. When we look at those encounters at the ports of entry, so Office of Field Operations, there's two ways to look at that. That's by weight and by number of events. If we look at it from events, so individual encounters, this fiscal year, we're at 73.1% are U.S. citizens, the balance being Mexican nationals. If we look at that by weight, we're looking at about 56% U.S. citizens. The delta between those two is a lot of the U.S. citizens we see are very small quantity personal use.
And what about convicted for smuggling fentanyl? Is it U.S. citizens, the majority?
Ma'am, I'm going to have to get back to you on that. I don't know the answer to that, but I will happy to get back with you.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thank you. So, Mr. Mandrick, would it be fair to say that the majority of seizures in between ports of entry, because even with the percentages you gave me, are also from U.S. citizens and U.S. persons, more so than from Mexican nationals?
It's a fairly close breakdown. We will have to get back with you on the specifics.
Thank you. Mr. Mandrick, can you also share the percentage of opioid CBP seized on migrants, not in vehicles, during the fiscal year? Do you have that information?
It's a very small percentage of those who were actually on migrants or opioids. We don't have the firm percentage. We can get back.
So very small percentage.
Yes, ma'am.
Correct? That's what I thought. So just to clarify, Mr. Mandrick, would you agree that undocumented persons traveling on foot between ports of entry represent a very small fraction of the people trafficking opioids across our borders?
Yes, ma'am. There's a variety of reasons behind that. The ability to exploit the illegal travel with millions of people each day back and forth, easy concealment techniques, operational security with a counter surveillance of individuals.
Thank you. We know the alarming number of fentanyl overdoses is emblematic of a larger drug abuse public health crisis that our country is experiencing and has been for decades. And I deeply sympathize with the losses that many families, including in the 3rd Illinois District, are facing. But this issue is broader than one of border security. In the words of Mr. Chester, and I quote, you said that one second, I want to get it right. Ending the opioid crisis doesn't start at the border and it won't end in the border. So I think we need to treat and demand driving this epidemic, and we need comprehensive health care and access to education, treatment for everyone. Mr. Chester, knowing that, what initiatives is this administration pursuing to prevent substance abuse in our communities and support these in recovery?
Thank you very much. And you stated correctly, right? The efforts that we take to keep these drugs out of our country have got to be complemented by strong public health efforts in order to be able to reduce their demand. And it really starts with prevention, particularly youth prevention. We out of ONDCP, manage the Drug-Free Communities Program, which is enormously successful, more than 700 coalitions funded around the country, focused at the local level in order to prevent drug use. The second thing is reducing barriers to treatment, whether those barriers are monetary or regulatory, ensuring that everyone who needs treatment is able to get it. And sadly, about 8 out of 10 Americans who need treatment don't have access to it. And then the final thing is to create communities and workplaces that are recovery ready so that individuals in recovery can continue their sustained recovery, stay with their families, get a good job, and not tragically enter back into the population of those using drugs.
Thank you for your time, and I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Desposito, my colleague from New York.
Well, thank you, Chairman, and thank you for allowing me to wave on to the subcommittee this afternoon. To all of you, thank you for being here. Prior to serving as a member of Congress, I was even prouder, I think, to be a member of the New York City Police Department, retiring there. as a detective. And I know that just working in the 5 boroughs of New York City, you get to see different district attorneys and what their priorities are, their prosecutorial priorities. So I guess this was really a question for Mr. Papadopoulos, but it's really open to all of you. Do you see that the people that you're arresting and hopefully eventually prosecuted, are you dealing with different prosecutors with different priorities, and is that hindering your ability to take illegal narcotics?
Sir, thank you for the question. As you know, as former law enforcement, we collect the evidence, we gather the evidence and present it to a grand jury or to a prosecutor's office, and they decide the most appropriate charges. So we don't factor into that, right, other than collecting the evidence.
Right, but what I'm asking is, have you seen it become more difficult with different prosecutors, the effective really the prosecution of drug arrests? Has it become more difficult as we see different prosecutors having different priorities? I mean, we see it throughout the United States of America, whether it's in cities like New York or places like California, where crime is rampant because we see over and over again repeat offenders, people that are they're being arrested, they're being sometimes prosecuted, and then they are let out to commit more crimes. And one of the biggest things that we've seen is repeat offenders. So have we seen in the issues on our southwest border, when we're dealing with specifically in this hearing, the trafficking of narcotics and fentanyl, have we seen repeat offenders, and has the ability of prosecutors and perhaps their priorities had an effect on the way that you guys are able to really take criminals off the street, and I think most important, keep them off the street?
Yes, sir. So for the border, I'll defer to DHS on what they're seeing there. I will say that DEA strives to prosecute federally, not at the local level.
Of course.
And what we see when we do that is that more of an impact in terms of crime reduction and sentencing.
Right, but even federal prosecutors, different offices have different priorities, and sometimes we see things headed in a different direction. So I guess for the border, I'll hand it over to you guys.
I don't oversee our domestic operations branch, but I will tell you that I don't believe that we have seen much of a change. There's a consistent cadre who works day in and day out on the law enforcement, either CBP or HSI side, that works continuously with U.S. attorneys to take cases to the federal level. I can take that as a get back. If there's something different, I can let you know.
Okay, perfect.
Sir, I'd have to go with our DA and HSI colleagues. When we get seizures, they're turned over to them for the prosecution.
Great. I yield back. Thank you, Chairman.
The gentleman yields. My colleague, Mr. Ivey, is recognized for 5 minutes for question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And before I start asking questions, I'd like to commend the chair for putting this hearing together. I waved in to the committee today and had just come over from another hearing, so I just picked up the witness testimony, and I came in and asked, I looked at the list and I asked staff, well, who are their witnesses and who are our witnesses? And they said, well, this looks like it's pretty much straight down the middle. And I must agree. I appreciate the fact that you put together a balanced hearing that's been very informative, and it's the first one I've had like this since I got to Congress, so thank you, sir. I did want to follow up on Mr. Gonzalez's questions about the drones issue, because when we went down to, I guess it was in Brownsville, and we were talking with some of the Border Patrol agents, they were echoing what he said. They said there was a lot of drones, that it's increased a lot, that more of them are being used to now ship the drugs, and that they were outnumbered. The ratio of 17 to 1 sticks out in my mind for some reason. And I think, Mr. Correa, we were trying to get some, and I don't know if it happened or not, but some language in the bill that we passed to try and see if we could get additional funding to increase your capability to get drones to try and respond to the amount that they're using. I know they're very well funded. They're keeping up with technology, and we have to hustle to keep up with them. But I did want to make sure that that's something that would be helpful to you. We're resources are short, but if you need additional help with the drone counter push on our part, I'd like to hear what your position is on that.
Absolutely, sir. Drones are something that's not going away. We're going to continue to see those, whether it's surveillance or narcotics movement. We also support the vast majority of SEER activities take place, so Super Bowl, large-scale events with the counter-UAS approach. So it's a holistically beneficial program.
Yeah, I think there's legislation that's coming through the House, but it's got multiple committees because there's multiple types of jurisdiction. So that means it's got a hard path to travel, but hopefully we can get there, and with your push, it might help to move it forward. So thank you for that. I wanted to ask you too about China and some of their activities. I think one of you said that they have porous borders, and so it's easy for bad actors to ship precursors and the drugs out. And then I believe it was Mr. Chester who mentioned that to the extent China is being cooperative, it can really enhance our efforts to reduce the drug flow. What kinds of additional steps can we take in your view? And I know this is ticklish, you're not State Department necessarily, but what can we do to help to address that? Because if we can help to cut it off at the source, that would really help our issues here.
Thanks very much. And I work with my State Department colleagues on this literally every day, and they do a remarkable job help managing this relationship. I think the first thing is we need dialogue with the PRC government. Routine collaboration like we've had in the past. That's the first thing. The second thing that we've specifically asked them to do is we presented them with what we call the 3 asks. The first one is implement quality, know your customer standards so that the shippers of precursors, pill presses, dye molds, encapsulating machines know that they're going to go to a legitimate business and they're just not filling every single order. The second one is to properly label those items in accordance with World Trade Organization standards so that pill press parts are labeled as pill press parts so that they can be inspected, and motorcycle parts are labeled as motorcycle parts. The third thing is to agree with the United States and other countries on and it's a finite list of legitimate, uncontrollable chemicals because they have so many legitimate uses that can be combined and turned into precursor chemicals for making synthetic opioids or other synthetic drugs. 3 things that are really just due diligence on the part of any responsible country that not only the PRC, but all countries, and we've talked to all countries about doing this, in order to be able to help dry up this permissive environment in which these items can move around in plain sight. The last thing is the PRC needs to join with us in partnership at the global level. And this is particularly true in light of the establishment of this global coalition. They hold a major role in this problem, and they should, as any great nation, hold a major role in its solution as well. And we look forward to them engaging with us and doing that.
I thank you for that, and I yield back the balance of my time. And thank you again, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yields, and my colleague from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, is recognized for 5 minutes for questioning.
Let me thank the chairman and ranking member. I was just in judiciary, so I'm somewhat delayed and may be asking questions that have already been asked. But let me start with the Principal Deputy Administrator of the DEA, Papadopoulos, and really hone in on the DEA's work with respect to opioids and the fact that fentanyl, which is synthetic, is found in drugs for medical use and is sometimes used to lace other drugs, and as well are sold online, come in pink pills, multicolored pills. How difficult is the fight for fentanyl, and what are the elements that the DEA uses? I know this on the criminal side, you deal with scheduling of drugs. We've not yet scheduled fentanyl, but how difficult is this fight?
Yes, thank you, ma'am. So we are using all the tools that we have available and the authorities that we have been given to battle this unprecedented epidemic that we're facing right now. As you mentioned, we are having millions of pills come into the United States. 6 out of 10 have a potentially lethal dose. That's up from 4 out of 10 last year. So we are committed to doing everything we can to prevent the overdose deaths that are happening throughout the country.
Well, what is your, let me get you to be more extensive, everything you can, but what are are you targeting certain areas? How do you incorporate the fact that there's medical uses? Are you seeing a criminal element that is separate and apart from the cartels? Because fentanyl is everywhere. Can you comment on that, please?
Yes. So we are domestically, I mentioned Operation Last Mile, which resulted in the cartel distributors' arrests in the United States. Also, we have Operation Overdrive, which is data-driven, and it focuses on areas of the country that have a high number of overdose deaths and drug-related violence. And we're working with our state and local partners to identify those areas. Most recently, we are in 57 cities in 36 states. Phase 1, which ended last year, resulted in significant decreases in fatal shootings and homicides in Philadelphia and the Kensington area. And Phase 2 is ongoing, and Phase 3 is coming soon. So we're doing that. We also have Operation Overdose Justice, which focuses on deaths resulting from fentanyl, where we partner with state and local counterparts to bring the most appropriate charges when somebody does die, either through a fake prescription pill or if fentanyl is mixed with another drug.
Let me thank you very much. I am in the business of stopping fentanyl and particularly the impact that it's had on our children. I want to ask Mr. Chester what is being done as relates to research for treatments and opioid addiction, but particularly the impact on school children. And at this time, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to introduce into the legislation, my legislation, which is Stop Fentanyl Now Act of 2023. And I hope that there will be an opportunity for this legislation to be reviewed in this committee, Judiciary, and I know that there's an energy and commerce component. But included in here is the ability for more institutions to use the strips. Some states outlaw them as being a criminal element. And so, Mr. Chester, you want to comment, particularly focused on school children and the crisis we have?
Yes, Congresswoman, thank you very much. The first thing is our strong emphasis, and particularly in the National Drug Control Strategy, on youth prevention. And this is not only preventing at the individual level, but looking at the environmental factors that may lead to eventual substance use. That's the first thing. The second thing is you mentioned fentanyl test strips. Would also like to mention naloxone and increasing the availability of naloxone to get it in the hands of everyone who needs it so that anyone who suffers an opioid overdose, who doesn't need to die, that overdose can be reversed with the use of naloxone. And those are two important components of harm reduction. And the National Drug Control Strategy, this is the first time that harm reduction has been mentioned in a National Drug Control Strategy. And the last thing, when you talk about treatment, we have wonderful professionals at the National Institutes of Drug Addiction at NIDA who do research on this. I think the most important thing that we can do now is reduce barriers to treatment, particularly medication treatment for opioid use disorder, to ensure that everyone who needs treatment has access to it. That's probably the most critical, important thing that we can do in order to take the oxygen out of this illicit supply that's being pulled across our borders.
Mr. Chester, thank you. I wanted to end on your testimony because if we can cut the desire, then the supply has nowhere to go. And it is in our schools. My legislation, Stop Fentanyl Now Act, does with NARCOM, does the strips, and you have indicated it is a holistic approach. I just want to end, Mr. Chairman, by, I'm not sure if I did get a answer, but I'm asking unanimous consent to introduce in the record the Stop Fentanyl Now
Without
Act.
objection.
And additionally, I want to introduce into the record, fentanyl is dominating headlines, but there is a more comprehensive drug problem happening in Texas. And it goes on to talk about the broader crisis, synthetic opioids, and not taken alone. And so healthcare and law enforcement officials are dealing with multiple deadly drugs at once. That means we must cut into the desire. I use that term because it's desire because you're addicted. And so I thank you, Mr. Chairman. I hope you will consider and the ranking member your courtesies, but I hope you will consider the legislation because we have to find a multiple level of dealing with this. To the other witnesses, my time is gone, so I just want to express my recognition of your presence here, Mr. Kagan, Mr. Mandeek, Mr. Durham, and did not get a chance, but I'm well aware of the work that you're doing and challenges that we all have. I'll yield back.
Yes, ma'am. The gentlewoman yields. The ranking member and I, and perhaps our colleague, Ms. Lee, has another question, so I'm going to open for a second round of questioning. I recognize myself. Mr. Papadopoulos, some things along, some percentages and statistics are law enforcement sensitive, so I recognize that. But I'm going to ask you to share with America to the extent that you can so that the citizenry can comprehend just what an overwhelming challenge we face regarding the fentanyl that's already in our country. As we consider the volume seized, which is an unprecedented amount. You guys are pretty much seizing everything you have operational capability to seize. And it's an incredible job that you're doing. But regarding the volume seized, regardless of at ports of entry or between ports of entry, can you share with America what you would consider to be a number that the public could consume and would not interfere with the operations? What's the percentage of seizures versus the totality of volume that has come into our country?
Sir, thanks for the question. I think DEA strives to seize as many drugs as possible. We don't find any acceptable amount of drugs entering the United States. So we continue to do whatever we can.
Of course, and you're seizing all your, I would imagine if you had twice the staff, you'd be seizing twice the volume that you have right now. There's so much out there. A drug dealer told me last year, he said, Cap, we have so much fentanyl, we're giving it away. That's why people are dying. They want their product to be more popular on the streets, so they're making it heavier. And this is a guy that's been in the game for quite some time, is incarcerated. And he said that they essentially are giving volumes away, and when people start dying, they reel it back. He said that they abandoned volumes of fentanyl if they're going to cross state lines, if they're moving an operation to another state, because it's so much cheaper to replace the fentanyl than it is to risk the interstate trafficking. So you're seizing unbelievable volumes of fentanyl. But how does that volume compare with what, in your estimation, would be the total? You're seizing 25%, 50%, 15%?
Sir, I'd like to consult our intelligence division on that. I don't know that I would want to give you a more precise answer.
Right next to you.
This is DHS, but yes.
Sir, so a little explanation first. The challenge with something like fentanyl is being synthetic. There's no agriculture-based place to get an initial estimate. So unlike cocaine or marijuana, where we can kind of do an oversight to see general cultivation estimates, we can't do that with synthetics like fentanyl or methamphetamine. When we look at it holistically from an intelligence perspective, it's probably within that 25% mark based off demand in the
Thank you. I think that's an honest answer. That's an honest answer, and this will paint the picture for America of the challenge that we face. I yield the balance of my time and recognize the ranking member for additional questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to follow up on your question from a different perspective. And ports of entry, Mr. Mandrake, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but only 2 or 3% of our passenger cars are actually inspected right now with non-intrusive technology. 15 to 17% of our commercial vehicles are inspected, and you have these record volumes of seizures it's, the Biden administration now is talking about going to 40% inspection of vehicles coming through and maybe 70% of commercial vehicles by 2026. I'm going to ask you to straight line and speculate. What's it going to do to the seizures at the border?
Sir, as part of the layered approach, the non-intrusive inspection has become a key part of it. With that, 2% in the passenger vehicles has yielded a significant volume of overall seizures. So that extrapolation from that 2% to 40% will have significant increased seizures. And once you layer in things like the officer intuition, the canine capabilities, those seizure volumes are going to continue to increase.
And again, if I heard you earlier, all of you, your testimony, you're looking at drones now being a way of actually bringing in fentanyl into the United States. Is that correct?
There certainly is that potential, yes, sir.
I mean, I don't know what a drone costs, and I don't know what the value of a payload would be, but if we do a cost-benefit analysis, I'd imagine you can just flood any part of our border or borders to come up with a very profitable situation.
Yes, sir. The majority of the drones we've seen commercially available, things like the DJI, a couple $100 to $1,000 with payload capacities, 5-ish kilograms plus or minus, depending on what you're willing to pay.
And how much would that be in terms of value of fentanyl?
Depending on if it's...
You got a $200 drone, and what's the value of the payload?
You could easily have, $1 million worth per flight and continuous flights throughout the day.
How much?
Easily have $1 million per,
$1 million, so that's a pretty good return on your investment. And I know this last week I was in my district and I took a tour of a contractor that's about to put out a manufacturing really a system, not only of radar, but radar to interfere with the controls of drones as they move forward. I would imagine that's also in your horizon in terms of investing for our national defense and border defense. Yes, no?
Yes, sir.
And again, gentlemen, I would just come back to my earlier statement and challenge that I made, which is let us know what we, as members of Congress, need to look at to help you do a better job of defending our country against fentanyl and other negative things that come in. You're the experts. We look at little patterns, little tidbits of what's going on, but you're the experts and you need to let us know what it is that you need. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield the rest of my time to you.
The gentleman yields, and the gentlewoman, Ms. Lee, is recognized for additional questions.
I thank the chairman, and I want to just follow the line of questioning that I did not get a chance, and it might be redundant, but maybe asked in a different way. Whether it's the DEA or whether it's CBP and others, can I get, was it said, total amount in dollar value that's coming into the United States? And second, is most of it coming through the ports of entry, legal ports of entry?
Ma'am, I can begin to answer that question for you. So far in fiscal year 23, we're at just about 20,000 pounds of fentanyl seized by CBP along the border, 18,000 pounds of that with our Office of Field Operations at our ports of entry, and a little over 2,000 pounds with the U.S. Border Patrol.
Would you be able to capture what that might be in street value or any value?
It's a little bit tougher depending on the purity levels, powder versus pill format. With Operation Blue Lotus, as I had mentioned, alongside Four Horsemen, we've seized about 10,000 pounds on that had a street value of about $90 million.
DEA, do you have a different number of what you've been able to deal with? Thank you. Thank you.
Ma'am, we've seized this fiscal year approximately 57 million pills, which is about the same amount that we seized last year, and about 13,000 pounds of fentanyl powder. Again, the amounts vary. Pills can run anywhere from a few dollars if you're buying wholesale, all the way up, if you're just buying a single pill, $10 to $20 a pill. So it's hard to estimate.
And what have you found How difficult is the, first of all, let's say what you've seen if you're working with collaborative agencies of online sales and how difficult it is to catch the online sales. And I give the example that is so tragic and so difficult. Loving parents, great athlete, middle schooler, high schooler, A student, or average student, loved by all. And one moment they've gone upstairs to go to bed, and the next moment, in the morning hours, they are not with us. Pink pills, the online sales, the sale to children.
Yes, ma'am. Social media and online sales are an increasing problem that we are keeping a very close eye on. The cartels are advertising and selling on social media. An Operation Last Mile, which I mentioned earlier, which was the U.S. distributors, it was over 1,400 cases. About 40% of them involved social media. It is a certain issue that we are keeping an eye on. And as you mentioned, all these deaths are tragedies, of course. And I would point out that we had family members last summer come into DEA headquarters and tell us their stories, and they shared stories similar to what you just mentioned. And we started the Faces of Fentanyl, which is in our lobby. It started with a couple of hundred pictures. It is now up to 5,000 pictures. It covers 8 walls in the DEA headquarters lobby that every DEA employee has to walk past to get to work, that works at headquarters. The youngest person on that wall is 17 months old, and the oldest person is 70 years old, and a lot of them did buy the pills that ended up killing them over social media.
Our approach to getting that, again, my legislation deals with enhanced penalties. That's on the backside of it for those utilization on social media to sell pills. So it's on the criminal end. It has treatment in, as Mr. Chester emphasized. But anyhow, you know, how would it do an eagle eye on that? Those sales on that phone or that iPad, or when you're alone and you order them and they come in whatever package, or you send it to somebody else and you have pink pills and you take them.
Yes, ma'am. And that goes back to getting the word out. Public awareness is a big part of this, in addition to enforcement. The social media companies, frankly, have to do more. When I was growing up, if you wanted to buy drugs, you needed to know somebody that had them or where to go to get them. Right now, everybody with a smartphone knows a drug dealer, unfortunately, and that includes our kids. Getting the word out is going to help with that. And I mentioned earlier, we're in an unprecedented crisis, which requires unprecedented collaboration, including with social media companies, because with that collaboration, we will save lives.
Thank you very much. I think you're absolutely right. I am a rabid supporter of the First Amendment, but we have a crisis of, you've got 5,000 and growing. We have a crisis around children, and there is a level of responsibility that we must demand. And I thank you for these numbers. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields. I thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony and members for their questioning. Members of the subcommittee may have some additional questions for the witnesses. We would ask that the witnesses respond to these in writing. Pursuant to Committee Rule 7D, the hearing record will be held open for 10 days. Without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned.
Committee on Homeland Security, Subcommittee on Counterterrorism, Law Enforcement, and Intelligence will come to order. Without objection, the subcommittee may recess at any point. The purpose of this hearing is to receive testimony from a non-governmental panel of expert witnesses to examine the threats posed by nation-state actors in Latin America, like China and Russia, to the United States Homeland Security. And I now recognize myself for an opening statement. Good morning, and welcome to the Subcommittee on Counterterrorism, Law Enforcement, and Intelligence. Today, we are holding an important hearing on the threats posed by nation-state actors like the People's Republic of China, the PRC, Russia, Iran, and Venezuela in Latin America to our Homeland Security. There is no doubt that we are facing a migration crisis caused by the administration.